Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our flight. This is your captain speaking from sunny San Diego, California to 6th century Persia. Buckle your seatbelts. Daniel chapter 7. A couple of weeks ago, we started this chapter. And to backtrack a little bit for us to get situated once more, from chapter 1 to chapter 6, several stories of how God utilized Daniel and his friends in circumstances that seemed impossible to attain freedom, victory, liberty, so on and so forth. And now from chapter 7 till the end of the book, it's different style, more prophetic, apocalyptic, things that are a little harder to understand, things that resemble a little bit of the things that you'd find in the book of Revelation, for example. And here, additionally, in chapter 7, it's the last chapter, for reference sake, that we have Aramaic being used. I mentioned this a couple of months ago, probably. So the book of Daniel is written in two languages, Hebrew and Aramaic. Chapter 1 is all Hebrew. The very beginning of chapter 2, it's still Hebrew, but from verse 4, Aramaic starts, and then it ends now in chapter 7, and then from chapter 8 on, it'll continue in Hebrew. We don't know exactly why, but it does seem like this chunk of Daniel, it's sort of a sub portion of the entire book. And it kind of works in a chiastic structure. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's just a literary structure where you have the first thing matching the last thing, and then the next thing, the second to last thing. So A1, B, B1, C, C1, so on and so forth. So here in this last portion of this Aramaic part of Daniel, it really does match the first portion. What was that first portion? The first portion was when Nebuchadnezzar had that dream that needed to be interpreted by Daniel, the dream of the human-like statue that had different elements, materials that it was built out of. So the head, the torso, the limbs, the feet. And we saw then that very likely it all signified these different empires, starting with the Babylonian Empire and then succeeding throughout with other empires that would take over, and they would decrease in glory some way or somehow, and eventually the greatest empire and the greatest king would take charge. So we have something similar here, even though now Daniel is not necessarily interpreting a dream. He's actually receiving a dream. He has a dream that is very much parallel to this, where, as we saw in the first half of this chapter, he had this vision at night, or a dream, regarding these beasts of sorts. The first one was a lion-like beast, and we mentioned that very likely that referred to the Babylonian Empire. The second one was a bear-like one, and that likely was the Medes and the Persians. The third one was a leopard, likely the Greek Empire, and then the last one, the fourth one, was just weird. It didn't really resemble a particular animal per se. It had horns. It was just kind of described as something dreadful, a beast-like, creature. and it was the most fearsome one of all. And out of that would come another one, which was a little horn that would come. We get to the point of the chapter that we're going to get a little bit more interpretation as to all that, what actually it would eventually mean. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll read throughout this portion from verse 15 to verse 28. And you can follow along, and then we'll backtrack and take it one chunk at a time. So again, starting from verse 15 of Daniel chapter 7, it says, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit, within my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near to one of those who stood by and asked him the truth of all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. Those great beasts which are four kings, which arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Then I wished to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devour, broken pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. And the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely, that horn which had eyes and a mouth, which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. Verse 21. I was watching, and the same was making war against the saints and prevailing against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High. And the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces. Then the 10 horns are the 10 kings, who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. And the saints shall be given into his hands for a time, and times, and half a time. And the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. This is the end of the account. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. It's interesting that this section is sandwiched by Daniel being grieved and being troubled. As I read in the very beginning, it starts off by saying, I, Daniel, was grieved. And then towards the end, it states, for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me. That just goes to show you that sometimes ignorance is bliss. We would like to know a lot about most everything, and I think God in his mercies pumps the brake. Because if we were to know everything, or more so than we do, I don't think it would ease or appease our anxieties. I think God gives us just enough to be able to trust him and have peace, hopefully, but also not too much where we're going to be totally overwhelmed, because again, this sort of stuff is pretty troublesome. But Daniel was not as privileged as us. We have the privilege again of ignorance. He was someone who was endowed with a little bit more information, made sure that he wrote it down for our benefit, even though, once again, prophetic stuff, often it's hard to make sense of and perfectly understand. In the first couple of verses, we again see saying here, Daniel was grieved in his spirit, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near to one of those who stood by and asked him the truth of all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. So it's interesting. It's weird because, again, in the previous stories, Daniel was the one who was counted upon to interpret dreams of others, namely kings. And now he is the one that is having a dream, and within that dream or vision, he is asking someone else to interpret said dream. So here he basically asks one who was included in the dream. Very likely, this is a reference of what we previously saw in verse 10, when there was a description of the throne of God. In the first half of this chapter, on verse 10, it says, a fiery stream issued and came forth from before, 1,000 thousands ministered to him, 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. So there we have a scenery of God and his throne, and thousands of people, or likely angels, were there honoring and worshiping him. And here Daniel, he is transported, teleported into this scene. And he's sort of very likely, in the background, just kind of just peeking and trying to, get over the crowd's head to see exactly what is going on. He witnesses all of this crazy stuff, and he decides to ask. So he taps, very likely, an angel on the shoulder and basically says, hey, what is going on here? Because this is some crazy stuff. I do have an image of potentially what this dream that he had and the animals that he was witnessing. Again, this is a possible interpretation of this vision or this dream. But again, pretty crazy, pretty freaky, pretty uncommon to see some of this or any of this. Also important to note that in the beginning of the chapter, he basically says, then I wrote down the dream telling the main facts. So here he's not even saying everything. He's just giving like bullet points, just a summary. So he saw a lot more that he didn't dare or didn't care to write down, which is why, again, he needed some interpretation. He needed somebody to decipher this. I remember, for example, in a similar fashion, I had just gotten hired here. So, 10 years ago, within my first couple of months at the church, I was in the office. Just a regular weekday. Usually if you come by during the week, there's no one here except, whoever is in the office and maybe, anyone else who is driving by and I don't know, walking their dog or whatever. And then all of a sudden, I saw some cars coming into the parking lot. And I didn't really look. I just saw it sort of out of the corner of my eye. And then I noticed another one, and another one, and another one. So then it caught my attention. So I started kind of peeking through the window, just looking a little closer, and it was like heavy artillery stuff. Literally those Hummer-looking SWAT cars, and not only one, several of them, and out of them, cops or SWAT team people fully geared in heavy artillery and guns, and uncommon. Wouldn't you agree? So I was just there, just kind of looking around, and they just kept on coming in, kept on coming in, kept on coming in, to the point where that section of the parking lot was full of them. And I was thinking to myself, what did I do? Immigration, right? What did I do? And I was literally, it seems comical to you, but I was going through my head, what could I have possibly done? Because I've never experienced this. This did not happen in my previous church. So once I got a sense that it could not have been me. I mean, I'm not perfect. I'm as sinful as the next guy. But I don't think this is a viable, reason, for them to come to arrest me or anything. So then I opened the door. I started walking into the parking lot gingerly. No sudden movements, right? Just very calmly. And then I approached one, because by this time they were like in a circle. Almost like a huddle, but a huge one, because there were a lot of them. And I literally tapped one of these guys in the shoulder, and then he seemed annoyed. And then he was like, I kind of work here, and I was wondering what was going on. And then he says something like, we're doing some training here in town, and the parking lot is usually vacant, so we thought it would be okay for us to gather here first and then move on to the next, portion of our training. And I didn't want to make a big deal out of it because, again, they had guns. So I just pulled out a business card, and I said, maybe next time you let me know beforehand because this is kind of weird. And then continuing the story, they eventually left. I came back to the office, sat down, did whatever I was doing, and then I got a phone call, and it was Tommy. You know Tommy, right? And then Tommy, over the phone, he says something like, "Hey, what's going on?" Apparently, a neighbor who had his number had the same concerns. And probably Tommy had the same concern that I had as to, what did this guy do? Why is there a SWAT team in our parking lot? All of that to say, sometimes you need some explanation because weird things happen. And here, major weirdness was happening. And Daniel couldn't make sense of it. All he could do was just look around and then just find the nearest angel to him, tap him on his shoulder and say, "Hey, could you help a brother out? Please, I know that I've been the one endowed with this ability to interpret dreams, but I cannot make sense of this. Please help me." So the angel seemingly obliged and would go on to explain a little bit of what was happening here. So the next couple of verses, basically it's a summary of this explanation, and then there's going to be a little bit more detail given. So it says on verse 17 to 18, "Those great beasts which are four kings which arise out of the earth, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever." So again, this is a generalization, a summary, an overall idea of what was happening. Here we finally get the variables being interpreted or defined. These beasts were kings or kingdoms, which again, it kind of perfectly parallels the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had and then the interpretation that Daniel eventually gave to him. But then we have the added insight that after them, the saints of the Most High would receive a kingdom. So we have additional information. We have the kingdoms, but then we have the Most High, which is the King of Kings, and then we have his subjects, which are the saints that would eventually inherit, eventually take part in, but also seemingly rule over this final kingdom, which would be the best or the biggest or the most powerful one of all. Now from verse 19 to verse 22, Daniel wants to get something a little bit more specific, a clarity into one of the beasts, specifically the fourth one. Because based on the account, and we'd have to backtrack to the first half of the chapter, from verse 4 to verse 8, we have a description of each beast. And once you get to the last one, it's the crazy one. It's the dragon looking, can we put that again? The one in the back, right? The other ones kind of look more or less like conventional animals. Once we get to the last one, it just looks like something out of the ordinary, very, very scary looking beast. So there's a focal point on that one because it's sort of the climax of the story. Not only was it very weird looking, but then you have the additional information of the horns, and then these three horns that would be taken over by this one singular horn that would eventually become a primary subject of this story. And I already mentioned previously that very likely this is a reference to the Antichrist. It seems to match some descriptions that we have in other portions of Scripture pertaining to him. But again, Daniel wanted some specific information regarding this last beast. So it says here once again from verse 19 to around verse 22, "Then I wish to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. And the 10 horns were on its head, and the other horn which came up before which 3 fell, namely the horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, those whose appearance was greater than his fellows. I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and the judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom." So the first portion of this description, it parallels the description of the vision that we had in the first half of the story, and it gives some additional details, but those aren't very important. Again, remember my illustration about the washing machine, that I had all the pieces and you know, the hardware everywhere. Some of them I could name, others I can't or couldn't be bothered to name. Here it's something similar. There's a lot of things happening, a lot of elements to this story. All of them have meanings, but for our purposes, we don't need to analyze them to the nth degree, right? So we know that this is the fourth beast. Consequently, very likely, it's this fourth empire, which likely it's the Roman Empire. And it's a good description of what the Roman Empire was in history. Because, as mentioned before, all of these other empires were somewhat taken over, destroyed by others. But when Rome came, it sort of eventually ceased to exist, but not because it was conquered. It just kind of morphed into smaller kingdoms, which eventually became countries. But it essentially ruled in some way, shape, or form, or in one ramification or another, for like 1,000 years. So that's pretty impressive. And throughout history, we've seen people allude to the fact that they wanted to reinvent or make something that was similar, or a reincarnation of the Roman Empire. And it seems like, prophetically speaking, this is a possibility where eventually the Roman Empire, or an element of it, will arise once more. And potentially, this is a description of said empire. There is a note here that towards the end, the Ancient of Days would come and would judge and rule. And we've defined that possibly here, likely, it is a reference of God himself. Again, taking charge, and eventually, even though this little horn was prevailing against the saints, eventually the Ancient of Days, God himself, would come and would deal with them to the point where now the saints would be able to rule over this final everlasting kingdom. So now we have additional information. We have more insight into what is happening here. And then this angel of sorts continues specifically to talk about how this transition of power will occur. Again, from one kingdom to another, to eventually this most fearsome kingdom, to eventually having this person or entity coming out of this fourth kingdom, ruling over the world, subjugating and somehow prevailing against and tormenting the saints for a temporary period of time, and then eventually God himself coming to deal with this mess and give the kingdom to his saints. So from verse 23 on, we have more of this answer to the question that Daniel proposed, and it says here, "Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces. The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be different from the first ones." Let's pause right there. So it seems clear that there is a focal point or a significance regarding this particular number 10. We saw something parallel to this when Nebuchadnezzar was having that vision, because eventually when it came to the foundation of that statue-like figure, it got to the part where it had the feet and the 10 toes. Right? And here, again, we have something parallel, but now these are horns. And usually the interpretation of this, based on this context, the educated guesses, leads us to believe that these will be either 10 kingdoms or 10 kings or people of authority that will inevitably be in charge. And throughout history, well-intentioned people have tried to place this into the things that are happening in the world. Some of you might have been familiar when the European Union started to develop. Eventually, it was made up of 10 countries. It's fluctuated back and forth, but like in the 80s or early 90s maybe. And then people started freaking out because they're like, oh, it's happening. It's sort of like that meme in The Office where everybody's like, okay, it's ready, it's happening. And I chuckle at that because it's happened throughout history. Whenever something that remotely resembles this, people start freaking out and thinking that it is occurring at that particular time. While in heaven, I assume the angels are just chuckling, laughing at us, having a... The fact of the matter is, we cannot place this in history as of yet. It is symbolic language, so it's very hard to interpret this, but it doesn't seem like this has occurred yet, even though throughout history, people have made educated guesses when something is occurring in their time. It is likely, again, I'm not saying 100%, but it is likely that the description of what we are getting here pertaining to Daniel's dream is something that has not occurred yet. So the explanation continues, and it says regarding, after mentioning the 10 horns and then this one singular horn who would subdue 3 horns or 3 kings, on verse 25, it goes on to say, "He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law, and the saints shall be given into his hands for a time, and times, and a half a time. Likely, this is something that is parallel to what we see in Revelations. Now again, there are many possibilities, many interpretations as to the chronology of events leading up to the end of times. But one of these interpretations has to do with this period of time where there will be great tribulation upon the earth. And it's usually, if you read those chapters, 11, 12, 13, more or less around there, you will see a description of a time period that likely will consist of 7 years, and this period is actually split in half between the first 3.5 years and the latter 3.5 years. In other words, tribulation period and the great tribulation period. And a reference here, this reference, again, it kind of parallels that, because if you read, and it's a symbolic language and it's very general, but again, for a time, one, and times, plural, +2, and half a time, half. 1 + 1, or 1 + 2, 3, plus half, 3.5. It's a guess. It is an educated guess. It is one of the possibilities, but again, likely it's not something that has occurred yet. And if in fact it is giving us insight into what will occur in the future, this is a period of time where the Antichrist, an agent of Satan, will be in charge and will have enough influence in the world to try to change things around. There's a reference here of changing laws and whatnot. So just, a very manipulative entity that would sort of orchestrate the world as he pleases. And for a period of time, the saints will be tormented. They will be somehow subjugated by this figure for this particular time, which will end eventually when Jesus likely returns and deals with this mess. Continuing from verse 26, it says, "But the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him." So again, potentially, possibly, maybe even probably a reference of the return of Christ after all of this intensifies because of this greater influence of Satan and the Antichrist, Jesus himself coming back to deal with this mess and establish his kingdom once and for all, and having the saints, the believers in Christ, rule with him. And then, the chapter once again ends with the reference of Daniel saying, "This is the end of the account. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed, but I kept the matter in my heart." So here, very likely, we have a scene. We have a glimpse of the end of times, of what is to come. Daniel is freaking out. He starts grieved, and then he ends troubled. And even though he knows sort of the outcome, the end of the story, in general, it still seems pretty troublesome. Why? Because a lot of havoc, a lot of destruction, a lot of pain, and a lot of suffering will occur before the end comes. Daniel didn't know if that happened within his lifetime, or a little bit after, or furthermore. It is likely that, most of these things haven't occurred yet to the extent that we see here. But we do have certain things that we can grab hold of, be certain of. Even though, once again, we cannot define all the variables and make perfect sense of what is happening here, there are certain things that we can have peace in and rest upon. What are those things? Well, for one thing, we know that history is dictated and established by God. Now, he gives information pertaining to this history to different people in different ways. And here there's a famous quote by Winston Churchill. He said that history is written by the victors. What does that mean? Usually, people who write the history books are the people who won the wars, right? So they get to orchestrate, they get to describe the narrative based on their perspective because they won the war. They get to pick and choose what people are going to think about and understand after the fact. And here, it's a perfect description of this. Because the person who is giving this insight is the greatest victor of all. Sometimes it seems kind of weird how he describes it. And again, the angels are probably laughing at us, but there's a reason why we don't know everything perfectly. But we do know enough to understand that he who is the greatest victor of all is able to describe history in these ways and in other fashions for our benefit, but also just for us to understand that he, in fact, is in charge. So this is something, regardless of what is happening here, something that we can, again, rest upon. There's nothing that happens in history, in our personal stories, or history at large, that God is not orchestrating, dictating, or knowledgeable of. And even beyond this, we have, insights pertaining to the tumultuous nature of history. Again, here we're not talking about, campsite, kumbaya stories. We're talking about scary stuff. We're talking about beasts, leopards, lions, dragon-like, creatures. We're talking about torment. We're talking about destruction. We're talking about persecution. We're talking about empires rising and falling. It's pretty scary stuff. Likely, the intensity of this, even though we live in a fallen world, and the world, humanity, has tasted what that means to have this fallen realm be surrounding us at all times, we have not tasted the worst of it yet. The worst seemingly is yet to come. But regardless of this, we already know the final outcome. Even if things go from bad to worse, we have the assurance that the final outcome is already established, and that God, who controls it all, will, in fact, defeat the enemy, and not only reign, but allow us some type of agency and benefit in his kingdom. And that's the other thing that we see here that is very clear. Regardless, there are many possibilities, interpretations, theological perspectives pertaining to the end of times, most precisely the kingdom. Pre, a, post, pre-trib, mid-trib, post. If none of that makes any sense to you, you're better off for it. But it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. What is certain is there is a kingdom and there is a king. That's what's certain. There is a kingdom and there is a king. And not only will the kingdom be established in a perfect sense, the king will reign forevermore. And we who are his subjects, not only do we have the privilege of serving him, what is mind-boggling and totally counter all of history is that this king, who is the king of all kings, will allow his subjects to somehow reign alongside of him. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that amazing? Doesn't that give us a little bit more perspective as to the things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis? Even if they are painful, there is discomfort. Sin sucks. What we do, what is done unto us, this reality that we live in, it's just horrible. But we know the end of the story. And in the end of the story, we will be participating in a reality that we cannot even imagine. And we'll be doing so in a place of privilege. Subjects, yet reigning alongside of him. Amen.